Most people think wars are won by courage or strategy, but here's what no military academy will tell you. World War II wasn't decided by bullets or bravery, it was decided by gasoline, and one German officer discovered this terrifying truth when he captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel and realized his entire nation was driving toward its own funeral. December 1944, the Ardennes forest in Belgium, snow falling thick enough to choke the sky, and SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper stood beside a captured American fuel depot, watching his Panzer tanks drink deeply from enemy supplies, while behind him stretched a convoy of Allied trucks so impossibly long it disappeared into the horizon like a metal river that never stopped flowing. And in that single frozen moment, staring at those endless vehicles, he understood something that would haunt him until his last breath. Germany had already lost this war, not on the battlefield, but in the oil fields and factories an ocean away, and every drop of fuel his men were celebrating represented not victory, but the grotesque imbalance between what his country could produce and what America could casually leave behind. This is the story of how one German officer's desperate fuel raid became his awakening to an industrial reality so overwhelming it made all the courage and skill of the Wehrmacht meaningless, and by the time you understand what Peiper saw in those supply lines, you'll never look at World War II the same way again, because this wasn't a war between armies, it was a war between economies, and one side brought a knife to a gunfight, while the other brought every factory in Detroit. Let's go back 6 months before Peiper's moment of horrible clarity to understand how Germany ended up so desperately thirsty for fuel that they'd gamble everything on one last offensive. By mid-1944, the German war machine was running on fumes, both literally and metaphorically. Romanian oil fields that had kept their tanks moving were now in Soviet hands after Romania switched sides in August. Synthetic fuel plants across Germany were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombers who'd finally figured out that you don't need to hit every tank if you can just eliminate what makes tanks move. And the Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, was grounding more planes due to fuel shortages than combat losses. Meanwhile, across the English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean, the Americans were doing something that must have seemed like black magic to German planners. They were increasing production, not barely maintaining it or watching it collapse like Germany's, but actually making more planes, more tanks, more trucks, and more fuel every single month. The numbers were so absurd they seemed like propaganda, except they weren't. American factories in 1944 were producing one new aircraft every 5 minutes, one new ship every single day, and enough fuel to run not just their own military, but also supply Britain, the Soviet Union, and have plenty left over for operations that didn't even matter strategically, but they ran them anyway because they could afford to waste resources that would have been priceless to Germany. Joachim Peiper himself was a complicated figure, and understanding him matters, because his realization about fuel wasn't just military observation. It was personal devastation for a man who'd believed completely in what he was fighting for. Born in 1915 to a middle-class German family, Peiper joined the SS in 1934 when he was just 19 years old, attracted by the elite image and the promise that he'd be part of something historically significant, and he rose quickly through the ranks not just because of Nazi connections, but because he was genuinely talented at armored warfare, understanding instinctively how to use speed and surprise to compensate for inferior numbers or equipment. By 1944, he commanded the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, a unit that had earned a reputation for both effectiveness and brutality, and Peiper himself had been decorated multiple times for actions on the Eastern Front, where he'd led breakthrough operations that showcased exactly the kind of mobile warfare the Germans had pioneered. But here's what made Peiper different from the cartoon villain version of SS officers. He was educated, spoke multiple languages, had served as an adjutant to Heinrich Himmler himself, so he'd seen the highest levels of Nazi planning. And precisely because he was intelligent and informed, he was about to understand something that true believers often can't handle. That maybe everything you've sacrificed for and every person who died under your command died for a cause that was doomed from the start, not by moral failings, although those existed in abundance, but by simple mathematics and industrial capacity. The Ardennes offensive itself, later called the Battle of the Bulge by Americans, was Adolf Hitler's personal brainchild, and it was born from desperation, wrapped in delusion. By December 1944, Germany was being crushed from both sides, Soviets pushing from the east, Americans and British from the west. And Hitler's strategic thinking had deteriorated to the point where he believed one dramatic victory could somehow split the Western Allies from the Soviets and force a negotiated peace that would let Germany survive. The plan was ambitious to the point of fantasy. Gather the last reserves of German armor and infantry, hide them in the dense Ardennes forest where Allied air reconnaissance couldn't spot them easily, wait for bad weather that would ground Allied planes, then smash through the thinly defended American lines, race to the Belgian port of Antwerp, cut the Allied armies in two, and create such chaos that the British and Americans would have to negotiate. It was the kind of plan that sounds brilliant in a headquarters bunker at midnight after everyone's been awake for 30 hours, but it had one absolutely critical flaw that everyone knew about and nobody could solve. Germany didn't have enough fuel to reach Antwerp. German planners calculated they needed thousands of tons of fuel to sustain the offensive long enough to reach their objectives, but they only had enough to get their tanks about halfway there, so the plan literally included capturing American fuel depots along the way and using enemy supplies to continue the attack, which meant the entire operation's success depended on the enemy cooperating by leaving fuel in convenient locations and not blowing it up when they retreated. And if that sounds insane, that's because it was insane. But it was also the only option left for a regime that had burned through every resource and now faced either a desperate gamble or slow, inevitable defeat. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the German term for a battle group that mixed tanks, infantry, and support units under one aggressive commander, was chosen to be the spearhead of the entire offensive, specifically because Peiper had proven on the Eastern Front that he could move fast, hit hard, and keep advancing even when cut off from supplies. His force included about 70 tanks, mostly Panther and King Tiger models, that were superior to most American tanks in armor and firepower, plus half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadiers, anti-aircraft vehicles, and engineers whose job was to repair bridges and clear obstacles. The route assigned to Kampfgruppe Peiper was considered the most difficult of all the German attack paths. Narrow roads through dense forest, steep terrain, small bridges that might not support 60-ton King Tiger tanks. But it was also the most direct route toward the Meuse River and ultimately Antwerp, so speed was everything. Peiper was told explicitly, if you hesitate, If you stop to consolidate or wait for support, the entire offensive fails because the Americans will bring their massive reserves and air power to bear, and it'll be over. So drive, keep driving, ignore your flanks, ignore resistance. Just punch through and get to those fuel depots, because without them, you won't make it 3 days into enemy territory. The offensive began before dawn on December 16, 1944, when suddenly the Ardennes forest lit up with the largest German artillery barrage on the Western Front since 1940, thousands of guns firing simultaneously to shred American positions and create shock and confusion. The Americans were caught completely by surprise, partly because they'd assumed Germany was too weak for major offensives, and partly because German operational security had been extraordinary: radio silence, troop movements at night, even spreading false intelligence about defensive preparations. Kampfgruppe Peiper started moving around midnight December 16th into 17th, and immediately they ran into the problems that would define the entire operation. Roads were narrower than maps suggested, bridges built for farm equipment, not 70-ton tanks, were collapsing, traffic jams formed as vehicles bottlenecked at choke points, and even though American resistance was initially light because the troops here were either green replacements or exhausted veterans supposedly resting in a quiet sector, the terrain itself was fighting the Germans as much as any enemy soldier. But Peiper kept pushing, and here's where his reputation for ruthlessness became reality. When his column encountered American prisoners or Belgian civilians who might slow them down or report their position, they were shot, not as formal executions, but as casual, tactical decisions. Get them out of the way and keep moving. And the most infamous incident happened at Malmedy, where approximately 80 American prisoners of war were machine-gunned in a field. An atrocity that would later lead to war crimes, trials, but in the moment was just another few minutes' delay in Peiper's desperate race against time and fuel gauges. By December 18th, Kampfgruppe Peiper had penetrated deeper into American lines than any other German unit. They'd covered roughly 40 miles in awful conditions. They'd seized several small villages, but they'd also burned through most of their starting fuel, and the promised supply columns that were supposed to follow them couldn't keep up because the roads behind them were jammed with wrecked vehicles, and the Americans were already starting to reinforce and counterattack the shoulders of the German penetration. Peiper's tankers were doing the mental math that every armored commander dreads, looking at fuel gauges and calculating how many more miles before their 30-ton metal boxes became stationary pillboxes, and that's when scouts reported something that seemed like salvation. American fuel dumps near the town of Stavelot, thousands of gallons just sitting there because the Americans had retreated so fast they hadn't destroyed everything. The race to capture those dumps before the Americans could demolish them became Peiper's entire focus, and on December 18th his lead elements rolled into Stavelot expecting resistance, but finding chaos instead. American support troops who weren't frontline infantry, vehicles abandoned with keys still in ignitions, and most importantly fuel storage areas that were partially destroyed but not completely. Some tanks had been set on fire, but others sat full and intact. And the captured fuel wasn't the hundreds of thousands of gallons Peiper desperately needed for the whole offensive, but it was enough to refuel his immediate Kampfgruppe and keep moving for at least another day or two. This is where Peiper had his moment of realization that changed everything, not in a dramatic speech or documented conversation, but in the quiet horror of understanding that sweeps over someone when they're paying attention. He'd just captured what for Germany was a significant amount of fuel, 50,000 gallons or more depending on which depot and which accounts you believe, enough to keep his entire force moving for crucial additional hours. And his men were celebrating because fuel meant life, fuel meant mobility, fuel meant they could continue the attack, and maybe, just maybe, accomplish this impossible mission. But Peiper wasn't celebrating. He was staring beyond the depot at something that made the captured fuel meaningless. He was watching American supply convoys that hadn't even bothered to retreat, columns of trucks stretching back toward the horizon, hundreds of vehicles just casually driving around in areas that were theoretically under threat from his breakthrough. And these weren't elite armored formations. These were support troops, quartermasters, supply clerks, truck drivers, the unglamorous rear echelon personnel that every army needs, except the Americans had so many of them and so many trucks and so much of everything that they could afford to have massive supply operations running just miles from active combat. The contrast was devastating. Here was Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of Germany's last great offensive, elite SS troops with the best equipment Germany could scrape together, and they were fighting and dying for 50,000 gallons of captured fuel, while within sight sat an American supply network so vast and casual in its abundance that they hadn't even bothered to fully evacuate it. And every truck in that convoy represented an industrial capacity that Germany simply could not match, no matter how much courage or tactical skill the Wehrmacht possessed. Let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that's almost impossible to believe if you don't know the context. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 96,000 aircraft, not over the entire war, in 1 year, while Germany managed about 40,000. And that's with them desperately converting every factory they could into war production, while the Americans were still making consumer goods. American shipyards launched nearly 200 major warships, plus hundreds of support vessels and thousands of landing craft in 1944, while German yards were being bombed into rubble and couldn't replace losses. American factories built approximately 2,500 tanks and self-propelled guns in 1944, while Germany produced around 9,000, and the gap wasn't just in numbers, but in reliability, because German tanks, like the King Tiger, were engineering marvels, but mechanically complex and prone to breakdowns, while American Shermans were simpler, easier to repair, and there were always 10 more where that came from. But the really crushing statistic, the one that Peiper would have understood looking at those supply convoys, was trucks. America produced approximately 650,000 trucks in 1944, 650,000 more trucks in 1 year than Germany produced in the entire war. And those trucks were what created the mobile supply network that meant American forces almost never ran out of anything, while German forces were constantly scrounging and improvising and rationing. And fuel, the lifeblood of mobile warfare, the thing Peiper was literally fighting and killing for, America in 1944 produced roughly 6 billion barrels of oil. 6 billion, while Germany's synthetic fuel production and whatever they could still get from occupied territories added up to maybe 1/10 of that, and even that was declining every month as Allied bombers systematically destroyed the synthetic plants. The strategic implications of this industrial imbalance shaped literally every aspect of how the war was fought in ways most people never think about. American units in Europe weren't told to conserve fuel. They didn't have to carefully calculate whether they could afford to run engines to keep warm in winter, or charge batteries, or just move vehicles to better positions. They used fuel freely because there was always more coming. Truck convoys ran constantly, supply dumps were built up to absurd levels as buffers, and the entire American way of war was based on overwhelming material superiority that let them trade resources for lives. If we're not sure if there's an enemy in that building, we'll just destroy the building with artillery rather than risk infantry. If our tanks are inferior one-on-one to German Panthers, we'll attack with 5 Shermans for every Panther and accept some losses because we can replace tanks faster than Germany can. If an operation might need X amount of supplies, we'll bring 3X just to be safe because we can afford the waste. Meanwhile, every German operation at this stage of the war involved careful rationing, units shared ammunition, tank crews nursed every liter of fuel. The Luftwaffe grounded planes not because they were damaged, but because flying training missions was an unaffordable luxury when fuel might be needed for combat. And even food rations were declining as the occupied territories that had fed Germany's armies were liberated or cut off. The psychological effect of this imbalance was corrosive. German soldiers, by late 1944, could see what they were up against. Every soldier who'd fought on the Eastern or Western Front had stories about calling in artillery support and being told, "Sorry, we don't have shells to spare," while American artillery seemed to fire unlimited barrages. Every tanker had experienced running out of fuel during an operation, while American tanks just kept moving. Every Luftwaffe pilot who still flew talked about skies black with Allied aircraft, while their own airfields stood empty not from lack of planes, but lack of fuel to fly them. And the cumulative message was clear. You can be brave, you can be skilled, you can win individual engagements, but you cannot win a war against an enemy who outproduces you 10-1 in everything that matters. Peiper understood all this not abstractly, but viscerally, as he stood there in Stavelot watching his men refuel from captured American supplies, while beyond them, that vast supply network continued operating like his breakthrough was barely an inconvenience. He'd seen the Eastern Front, where German forces had learned to operate on captured Soviet supplies because their own logistics couldn't keep up with the distances involved, but the Soviets, at least, were fighting close to their own territory and industrial base. Whereas here in Belgium, the Americans were operating thousands of miles from home across an ocean, and they still had more supplies available than Germany did in its own occupied territory. The specific details of what Peiper thought or said at this moment aren't well documented. He wasn't the type to write philosophical diary entries about industrial economics, but his actions afterward speak volumes. He continued the attack as ordered because he was a soldier and those were his orders. But the desperate urgency that had characterized his advance up to that point was gone, replaced by a grim professionalism that suggested a man going through motions he knew were pointless. His Kampfgruppe continued toward the Meuse River, but the advance slowed, not just from American resistance, which was stiffening as reinforcements arrived, but from what seemed like a loss of belief that this offensive could actually accomplish anything meaningful, and by December 24th, when American air power finally broke through the weather and began devastating German columns, when supplies definitively couldn't reach forward units, when it became obvious the offensive had failed to achieve any strategic objectives, Peiper received orders to withdraw and fought a brutal rearguard action to extract what remained of his force from the salient they'd created. The broader Battle of the Bulge continued until late January 1945. It became the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe, roughly 19,000 Americans killed and 70,000 total casualties. German losses were probably similar in raw numbers, but represented a much larger percentage of Germany's remaining strength and included equipment and fuel they absolutely could not replace. Hitler had gambled everything on this offensive, creating political division among the Allies, or at least buying time for some miracle weapon or diplomatic breakthrough to save Germany. And instead, he'd accelerated his own defeat by burning resources in a failed attack that could have been used for defense. The tanks and fuel and ammunition expended in the Ardennes weren't available when the Soviets launched their next major offensive in January. The experienced troops lost couldn't be replaced with the old men and children Germany was now conscripting. And, perhaps most critically, the Luftwaffe's brief reappearance during the offensive used up fuel reserves that left it even more grounded afterward than before. Germany, after the Ardennes, was still fighting. German soldiers continued resisting with skill and courage that forced the Allies to pay for every mile. But strategically, the war was over. It was just a matter of how long it would take for the inevitable to occur, and how many more people would die before it did. For Peiper personally, the story gets darker after Stavelot. He successfully extracted most of his Kampfgruppe, but the massacres committed during the advance, particularly at Malmedy, were already being investigated by American authorities, gathering evidence for war crimes trials. After Germany's surrender, Peiper was tried in 1946 at Dachau, not with the major Nazi leaders at Nuremberg, but in a separate trial focused specifically on the killings of American prisoners. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment as Cold War politics complicated how aggressively the Western Allies wanted to prosecute German officers. Then his sentence was reduced again, and he was released in 1956 after serving about 11 years. The rest of his life was spent in a strange limbo. Some old SS comrades treated him as a hero. Others avoided him because association with convicted war criminals was professionally toxic. He worked various jobs under assumed names because his real name brought attention and threats. He eventually settled in France in a small village under a pseudonym, and in 1976 he was killed when his house was burned down in what was almost certainly arson by someone who discovered his identity. Whether communist resistors or other revenge seekers remains unclear, but Peiper died violently, just as he'd lived violently, and his entire life arc, from true believer to disillusioned soldier to convicted war criminal to murdered exile, represented in one person the trajectory of the Nazi regime itself, built on violence and ideology, sustained by conquest and exploitation, destroyed by the mathematics of industrial warfare, and haunted afterward by the crimes committed along the way. But let's zoom out from Peiper's individual story to understand the bigger picture of how industrial capacity determined the war's outcome in ways that most dramatic retellings skip over. World War II in Europe is often presented as a battle between freedom and tyranny, between Allied heroism and Nazi evil, and those moral dimensions are real and important. But underneath the moral story is an economic story that's just as important for understanding why events unfolded as they did. Germany in 1939 was a major industrial power. It had world-class engineering, highly educated workforce, sophisticated manufacturing, and it had spent years under Nazi rule frantically rearming and preparing for war, while France and Britain were still hoping to avoid conflict, which gave Germany significant initial advantages in everything from tank quality to tactical doctrine. But Germany also had fatal structural weaknesses that no amount of engineering excellence or tactical brilliance could overcome. It lacked petroleum resources and had to rely on imports or expensive synthetic production. It lacked certain strategic minerals that modern warfare required. It had a smaller population than the combined enemies it was fighting, and most critically, Germany's industrial base, while sophisticated, was not actually that large. It was smaller than America's, smaller than the Soviet Union's, and approximately equal to Britain's, which meant from the moment Germany went to war against multiple major industrial powers simultaneously, it was facing a race it couldn't win, either achieve quick decisive victories before the enemy's superior resources could be mobilized, or face inevitable defeat as those resources ground down German strength through attrition. The early German victories from 1939 through 1941 succeeded precisely because they were quick and decisive. Poland fell in weeks. France fell in weeks. The Balkans fell quickly. These were strategic operations that captured territory and resources before the defenders could fully mobilize their potential, and each victory gave Germany access to the food and resources and industrial capacity of conquered nations, which partially offset Germany's structural disadvantages. But then came the two fatal decisions that guaranteed Germany's eventual defeat. Invading the Soviet Union in June 1941 created a war of attrition on a continental scale against an opponent with vastly more territory and resources and population than Germany, and declaring war on the United States in December 1941 added to Germany's enemies a nation that alone had more industrial capacity than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined, and from those two moments the outcome was mathematically determined. It was just a question of how long it would take for that industrial advantage to translate into battlefield victories. The Soviet Union by 1942 had moved factories wholesale to the Urals beyond German reach, and was producing tanks and artillery at rates that steadily overwhelmed German forces regardless of the superior training and tactical skill of the Wehrmacht. Soviet T-34 tanks were simpler than German Panthers, but the Soviets made tens of thousands of them and could afford to take heavy losses in ways Germany couldn't. Soviet artillery densities in major operations were absurdly high, hundreds of guns per kilometer of front, concentrated for breakthrough operations because they could afford to expend ammunition at rates that would have been impossible for Germany. And meanwhile, the United States was ramping up production of everything, training millions of soldiers, building thousands of ships to move supplies across oceans, and preparing for operations on multiple continents simultaneously. And by 1943, when American production hit full stride, the disparity became impossible to ignore. The specific way this industrial disparity manifested in actual combat operations is worth understanding because it explains why individual German tactical victories became strategically meaningless. German forces throughout the war consistently demonstrated superior training and tactical flexibility at small unit level. German tank crews averaged more kills per tank lost than their Allied counterparts. German infantry often outfought numerically superior opponents. German officers were better at improvising solutions to unexpected problems. These weren't propaganda claims, but factual patterns recognized even by Allied commanders. But none of it mattered strategically, because the Allies could afford to lose more tanks and more soldiers and more equipment and still grow stronger while Germany grew weaker with every loss. There's a famous quote attributed to various German commanders that captures this, first cited attributed to Rommel, but probably apocryphal, that goes something like, "The Americans don't have better soldiers, but they have more of them. They don't have better tanks, but they have more of them. They don't have better pilots, but they have more of them. And the more is enough." And that was the essential truth that Peiper glimpsed at Stavelot. All the elite training and tactical excellence and ideological commitment of the SS couldn't overcome the fact that the enemy had 50 more fuel depots behind this one, and 100 more behind those, and the production capacity to refill them faster than Germany could capture them, and the industrial strength to not even care that much about losing 50,000 gallons, because that was a rounding error in their total logistics operation. The fuel situation specifically shows how this disparity cascaded through every level of military operations. German fuel shortages meant planes stayed grounded, which gave Allies air superiority, which meant German ground forces operated under constant air attack while Allied forces moved freely. Lack of fuel meant German tanks couldn't train as extensively, which reduced crew quality over time, while Allied tank crews got thorough training because fuel for practice wasn't scarce. Fuel shortages meant German mobile reserves couldn't respond quickly to Allied breakthroughs because they literally didn't have enough fuel to drive where they needed to go. And the entire German tactical doctrine that had conquered most of Europe was based on mobile warfare, rapid movements, breakthrough operations, encirclements, all things that required fuel, so fuel shortages didn't just limit operations, they fundamentally undermined Germany's entire approach to warfare. By contrast, the Allies, by 1944, were fighting a fuel-intensive style of warfare that would have been impossible for Germany even at its peak. Constant air patrols over German territory, mechanized armies that moved dozens of miles per day during advances, naval operations in multiple oceans simultaneously, strategic bombing campaigns that flew thousands of heavy bombers each raid. All of this consumed fuel at rates that were only sustainable because of American oil production and the fleet of tankers that hauled it across oceans to wherever it was needed. There's a broader lesson here about how wars are actually won that most people miss because it's less dramatic than stories about heroes and battles. Wars between industrial powers are decided by the boring logistics of who can produce more stuff and move it where it's needed. The romance of warfare is in the courage and sacrifice of individual soldiers, but the outcome is determined by accountants and factory managers and logisticians who never see combat. Nazi Germany bet everything on their ideology that will and racial superiority could overcome material disadvantages, that German soldiers were inherently better than their opponents, and that superior tactics and fighting spirit would compensate for industrial inferiority, and for a while against unprepared opponents. This worked. But once Germany faced opponents who'd mobilized their full industrial potential, all the ideology and tactical skill in the world couldn't overcome the math. The Soviet soldier in 1945 fighting his way into Berlin wasn't inherently better than the German soldier defending it, but the Soviet soldier had artillery support from thousands of guns because Soviet factories had made them. He had tank support because Soviet factories made more tanks faster than Germans could destroy them. He had air support because Soviet and American air forces had swept the Luftwaffe from the skies through sheer numerical superiority, and he was fed and equipped through supply lines that stretched back to industrial centers the Germans could no longer reach, while the German soldier defending Berlin was running out of ammunition and food and hope because the supply network that sustained him had collapsed under the weight of Allied industrial and military pressure. Peiper's realization at Stavelot was this truth crystallized into one moment, looking at captured fuel that should have felt like victory, and seeing instead the vast American supply network behind it that made the captured fuel meaningless because there was always more, so much more, an endless stream of production that Germany could not match or disrupt or outlast. It wasn't a realization that made him stop fighting. Soldiers don't usually have that luxury. But it was a realization that stripped away any illusion about what the outcome would be. This wasn't going to end with Germany negotiating from strength or achieving some kind of stalemate. This was going to end with Germany crushed under the weight of Allied material superiority, while German soldiers fought increasingly hopeless defensive battles until they literally ran out of bullets and fuel and men. The Ardennes offensive was supposed to change this equation through one dramatic victory that split the Allies and bought time. But what it actually did was demonstrate that even Germany's best remaining units, using surprise and tactical excellence, couldn't break through Allied lines deep enough to matter because the Allied depth of resources was just too great. There were always more American units behind the ones you broke through, always more supplies, always more reinforcements, a military machine so vast that even successful tactical operations against it were like punching ocean waves. You might make a splash, but the ocean doesn't notice. After the war ended, historians and military analysts have spent decades studying the Ardennes offensive, trying to understand what, if anything, Germany could have done differently to change the outcome. And the consensus is basically nothing. The offensive failed not because of specific tactical mistakes, although there were some, but because the fundamental strategic concept was flawed. Germany didn't have the resources to reach Antwerp, even if everything went perfectly. They didn't have enough fuel, didn't have air superiority, didn't have the ability to protect their supply lines, and couldn't have held captured territory even if they'd taken it, because Allied counterattacks would have been overwhelming. The more interesting question is why Hitler ordered the offensive when his own generals told him it couldn't succeed, and the answer seems to be that by late 1944, Hitler had no good options left. Every choice led to eventual defeat. Sitting on defense meant slow, grinding retreat on both fronts until Germany was overrun. Trying to negotiate meant admitting defeat, which Hitler's ideology couldn't accept. And launching offensives at least offered the psychological comfort of taking action, even if the action was futile. There's a particular kind of desperation that comes from knowing you're losing but refusing to accept it, a mindset that leads to increasingly irrational decisions justified by wishful thinking, and the Ardennes offensive was that mindset made military strategy. Maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe the Allies will panic. Maybe bad weather will neutralize their air power long enough for us to win. Maybe capturing some fuel will let us keep going. An endless series of maybes built on top of the foundational delusion that Germany could still somehow win a war it had already lost. For the soldiers who fought in the Ardennes on both sides, the broader strategic futility wasn't obvious in the moment. They experienced it as brutal, close combat in awful winter conditions. American units that had been overrun fought desperate holding actions to slow the German advance. German units that broke through faced constant harassment from American forces on their flanks. Both sides suffered from frostbite and exposure in some of the worst winter weather in decades, and the human cost was enormous, with thousands killed and wounded for territory that changed hands multiple times and ultimately didn't matter strategically. The American soldier freezing in a foxhole in the Ardennes wasn't thinking about industrial capacity. He was thinking about survival and not letting his buddies down. The German soldier attacking that position wasn't contemplating oil production statistics. He was focused on the immediate tactical problem of breaking through the defense, and for both of them the war was terrifyingly real and immediate, regardless of what the eventual outcome would be. But the strategic irrelevance didn't make their sacrifice meaningless. It made it tragic. They were brave men fighting courageously for causes that were already decided by factors beyond their control. The American soldier was dying to slow an offensive that couldn't succeed anyway because Germany lacked the resources to sustain it. The German soldier was dying for a regime that had already lost but refused to surrender, and the whole battle was a microcosm of the final year of the war, lots of individual courage and suffering in service of a strategic situation that was effectively over.